And thank you for tuning in this evening with the Student Alliance for Prison Reform's webinar series. Tonight we're going to be delving into a subject of incredible importance, discussing the unique obstacles faced by women within the criminal justice system. This is both from an incarceration and a reentry standpoint. Moderating tonight's newest presentation installment, I'm SAPR Communication Director Hallie Israel. Joined by me is a panel of experts who will be answering questions and providing insight into this complex topic. They include Kelly McCarron, Safer Education Director, Georgia Lerner, the Executive Director of the Women's Prison Association, and the Open Society Foundation's Christina Voight. Ladies, thank you again so much for being with me here tonight. Do you all want to start off by providing us with just a brief introduction of yourselves and your history of involvement with women in the justice system? You all have more accolades and accomplishments than I could list.
I'll begin. I'm Kelly McCarron. I am part of the Student Alliance for Prison Reform and a junior at Suffolk University in Boston. What I hope to bring to tonight's webinar is my personal experience. I did some time in a women's facility in 2010 and am now studying psychology and criminal justice and hope to work within the criminal justice system, hopefully with re-entry specifically. So I'm excited to be here tonight. Thanks.
All right, that's great. Georgia, did you want to go next?
Sure. Is it? I don't have to do anything, right? You got my mic, right? Okay.
Yep.
Okay. I'm the executive director of the Women's Prison Association. I've been here for just about 15 years, and our agency was founded in the mid-1800s, and we work with women at all stages of criminal justice involvement. And in my work, I get to work with women who are getting ready to come home from prison, who've been arrested. We do quite a lot of work around diversion from incarceration and to try to prevent women from getting involved in the system. And our focus is largely on trying to improve systems and prevent women from having convictions attached, and really trying to be smarter about the ways that we respond to crime so that we can prevent families from getting involved in crime and so that we can prevent the long-term impact of someone having an arrest or having a conviction.
That's incredible. And then Christina?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me join you. I'm Christina Voight. I currently work at the Open Society Foundation. And tonight I'm hosting 30 incredible advocates from around the country working for criminal justice. I was incarcerated for 4 years at Bedford Hills Correctional Facility, where I also founded 2 programs and hosted a 3rd program, the foster care and child custody clinics. Women in
All right. Well, thank you so much, Christina. We seem to be having a little bit of a sound problem on the end of your mic system, so we're just going to go ahead and move along, but that was a great introduction. Thank you again, all of you, so much. We are so privileged to have you here. And we're just going to begin right now going into the questions. So to begin our discussion, I'm just going to provide a little background on our viewers, just on the raw numbers of women in incarceration. Today in the United States, over 1 million women are currently under some type of correctional supervision. And although occupying 7% of the population in the state and federal prison system, they are increasing at nearly double the rate of men, vastly contributing to the phenomenon that we all know as mass incarceration. So I think that the first fitting question for our panelists here is simply, in your experience in work within the prison system, is the institution itself adequately prepared to handle these unprecedented increases of female offenders? So, Georgia, did you want to go first?
Sure. I mean, I think the answer is no. The system, the prison and jail systems were not designed to accommodate women in the first place. They're very much designed to accept men, and not that they're really designed to do that in a really productive way, but they're really not designed to be responsive to the needs of women. And most of the tools, even in really forward-thinking, progressive prisons and jails, the tools that they use to assess the needs of prisoners who are coming in are usually considered gender neutral, and they're really geared towards the needs of men. And so they're really not set up to assess what women need, to house women in a way that takes into account the kinds of experiences they've had before they get to prison or jail, or to respond to those needs in a way that is likely to help women come out less damaged than they were when they entered. So I would say the answer is definitely no.
Thank you. That was really insightful. Do we have any other comments from either Christina or Kelly?
Well, I think I agree with Georgia for one, and I think that's like kind of reflected in our society, but how little facilities there are for women, and like the overpopulation that those facilities are currently facing, which makes the situation even more exasperated, the need for it. But I know for me, I am from Martha's Vineyard, and our jail, a very small jail, only holds men. So I had to be sent off island to, which technically is Barnstable County Correctional Facility, which technically is a men's facility, but they have 2 women housing units in it. So I don't think ideally we wouldn't have to be building more prisons, but I don't think there is enough for women specifically.
I didn't hear all what Georgia was saying, and the problem with the statistics that they're little warped, women that are incarcerated, that what the statistics show. We didn't count for any of the immigration detainees that get housed in these detention centers for years and years and years because they're waiting for deportation. They're not state sent, they're not federal state, and so these prisons become a warehouse for these women. So I would say there's almost a quarter more of what you have told already. And right now the back units that you go to are these houses where they would usually house 60, now they're 120, because the states are in a really funky state, is that we're going to release prisoners, but we don't want to build more prisons, so we'll just build more beds in the prisons we have to accommodate what we currently overcrowded prison population. And one last note is that we have to remember, especially in these states that haven't raised the age, 16-year-old girls are coming into the prison system from juvenile detention, which is even increasing more of the women's population. And as we increase our juvenile incarceration rate, actually they'll age out and go into the prison system. So we are definitely not ready for this any kind of services or the crowding that it's going to hold in the future.
Yes, definitely. And that underreporting of facts and figures is really astounding. Next, I think I'd like to move on to some of the unique obstacles faced by women post-arrest. And we're going to start with the subject of abuse. So most studies report that of the 57.2% of females who report abuse before admission to prisons, about 39% of them categorize this abuse as sexual in nature. And of these women, an overwhelming 70% have faced the abuse before age 18. Now, my question for all of you is, does the fact that over 1/2 of these female offenders have been previously victimized in some fashion affect the type of treatments and programming that they have access to within the prison system?
Well, I'll go first. I know when I was incarcerated, the only services that we have were inmate-led programs, and some of the volunteers that came from the outside. I spent 12 years since I've been in prison. I don't think they haven't improved anymore, but a lot of stuff is dictated through the men.
Oops.
Yeah,
I think that Christina's microphone went off again. If Georgia, you wanted to continue, that'd be great.
Yeah, I mean, I think for what Christina said, we're still doing work in those prisons, and there is definitely a different need for services. I mean, many of the men who are in prison also were sexually abused as children, but the difference is that for women, the abuse, if a woman was sexually abused as a girl, it is quite common for the abuse to continue into adulthood. Whereas if boys are sexually abused as children, it is less common for the abuse to continue into adulthood. So for women who are in the criminal justice system, there really is a need for these different types of services. And from what we see, as Christina was saying, there isn't something different available. And the actual environment of prison can be very traumatizing. The physical setting is not one that generally feels safe for people. There are a lot of features of most prisons that feel pretty restrictive, and if a woman experienced any of those things that happened to her as traumatizing, prison itself can be re-traumatizing. So usually there are not special programs that are sponsored or provided by a correctional system. Sometimes outside agencies can bring programming in, and I would say we have a much better understanding of what women need, but it has not translated into the provision of those services. And I would also point out that prisons and jails were not created to provide trauma treatment, right? So I mean, we're sending a lot of people to prison and jail who have needs that cannot realistically be dealt with by a correctional system. They should be dealt with in another way, and people shouldn't have to go to prison or jail to have these underlying needs met. And often prison and jail are are the worst places to send people if we want to try to deal with those underlying factors that contributed to their criminal behavior in the first place.
That's very true, and that actually has a lot to deal with our next question. But Kelly, did you have any contribution to this question you'd like to make before we move along?
I was going to say I completely agree, and to piggyback on what Christina was saying, even more recently, I don't think there are, my experience anyway, there was not really specialized treatment options like that. There was and I'm sure this is the case in most prisons, a psychiatric doctor, but a lot of it wasn't personalized enough. It wasn't like there wasn't enough personalized attention and help to deal with those traumatic issues that really can't be solved in like Georgia was saying, in a setting like prison. So I found that to be very true.
Those are all really great points. Thank you all so much. And that actually leads up to our next question, talking about mental health issues. And although I know that this issue is not unique to females, incarcerated women do report significantly higher rates of mental health problems than males. Today in the United States, we have about 73% of incarcerated females reporting symptoms of serious mental health problems. And my question to all of you would be, what barriers do these issues pose to successful rehabilitation within the prison system? Because as Georgia said, these institutions were not made to help women or men cope with these types of issues.
Well, it's Christy again, and I think one of the things that I have developed recently and looking over some of the research is that mental illness gets defined in our court systems. So when women go to prison, they're diagnosed with mental illness according to a judge instead of a medical doctor diagnosis. So when women go in with mental illness, usually these are diagnosed by like I said, reiterate, the judge. Therefore, we don't have psychiatric evaluations when we go in there. It's very few. So I would say more than 60 to 70% have mental illness, but they're not diagnosed by a physician. They're more or less diagnosed by the justice system or in the intake of a nurse and not a mental health care provider.
That's a really great point. Did anyone else have anything to add?
I think that it may even be an underreporting though, and that if we had, it's not that easy to get psychiatric providers to work in the prisons and the jails, and even, in the court system around that. It's not always easy to get people to do the assessments and diagnoses, but I think that the rate of serious mental illness might even be higher than the 73%, and that there is certainly not enough access to qualified, consistent mental health services and enough attention devoted to connecting women with those services, because there's also still a tremendous stigma around using mental health services. So getting people connected and diagnosed properly and into treatment is a big challenge in the community, and in a prison setting it can be even more of a challenge for the reasons of it's difficult to get the providers in there, and it's also sometimes difficult to get the women to want to use the services. So there are even more structural barriers than on the outside.
That's very true. And Kelly?
I would just say I would agree, and a lot I can think of particular. It's like bringing back flashbacks, but of particular issues where or circumstances where stories of abuse and like mental health, like those were very relevant in like many of the women, if not all of the women that I became close with or talked to when I was in there, and it's something that's overlooked for sure within the day-to-day running of a prison.
It really, truly is. And just going along with the idea of mental health, a recent study in my own home state found that there are over 10 times as many mentally ill women in the prison. Be an underreported figure. I know that Georgia did a great job discussing a lot of the structural barriers to dealing with that phenomenon. So we're just going to go right ahead and move on to the topic of employment. So approximately 7 out of 10 women who are under correctional control today have at least one child who's under the age of 18. And then there are an additional 1 in every 25 women who are entering the prison system my question for you all is, what ramifications does this have on So, were there any thoughts on this topic, or should we move on to another question?
Would you mind repeating the question, Hallie? It blinked out for a sec.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So we were talking about how approximately 7 out of 10 women under correctional control today have at least one child under 18, and then an additional 1 in every 25 women who are entering the prison system have an ongoing pregnancy. So my question for you all was just, what kind of ramifications does this factor have on the nearly 750,000 children who have a parent involved in the justice system today?
I mean, I think there are tremendous. I think there are tremendous implications for children who, you know, I would say have a right to have access to their parents. And in general, the location of where a parent is incarcerated is, you know, location of children is not taken into consideration when the placement of a parent is decided for incarceration. And it's something we've brought up quite a bit in New York State, and certainly in the federal system, it's not taken into consideration. People are, you know, there are very few federal prisons for women. So it is, children really do suffer the loss of the parent, because geographically parents are almost always pretty far away from their children, and so it's quite difficult to maintain a relationship in a, you know, in as meaningful a way as parents would like to. I mean, I'm wondering, Christina and Kelly, what you think.
Yeah, I agree with you, Georgia. I think if people would look at the statistics of the rising incarceration of women, oh, I think something just went. Can you all hear me?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
We can.
I think that with the rising cost of rising of women incarceration, you also started to see the rise of juveniles or children who were incarcerated, and the bond is broken. And mom is mom, whether she has some kind of challenge within a family or not. Children want to see their mothers. Children want to see those who they are, who raised them. And if you start separating the family bond, this is the reason you're just reciprocating the incarcerational cycle. So you take the children away from the mom, then more or less you're going to see that the child is going to repeat the mother's prison cycle. And, you know, this is the whole thing of poverty. This is where you get the have and have not. The majority of people are poor. They can't afford to go upstate. They can't afford to do these visits. They can't afford to keep attachment. But the few that are be able to keep this unification, you will see these children, the very few that there are, succeed in college and high school. But, you know, Bedford is notorious for the studies on this, keeping the children close with the mother, giving the mother education and services, and you see the child do better. I mean, it's common sense. It's not Freudian science. It's just common social sense of keeping families together.
That really is a great point. Thanks for putting that all in perspective.
Well, I want, if I can just add one thing, because I'm really glad Christina brought that note up about how we see a lot of children end up in the criminal justice system if their mother has been locked up. And it's one of these discussions I love and hate, because people, you know, people bring it up, and it is a pattern that we see. And as Christina pointed out, it's really more about the cycle of poverty and the fact it's not because a mother was in prison. It's about the conditions, really, and we need more research on it, but it's really more about the conditions that exist in that child's life, or that have been repeated generation after generation, where a child, when we look at the risk factors for a woman to commit a crime or to end up in the criminal justice system, they have to do with parental stress, they have to do with mental illness, educational deficits, economic deficits, antisocial associates, the kinds of things that will tend to be repeated if her child, you know, for the child, if the child is in an unstable home and does not have, you know, we could be working with the mother in the household with the children, trying to improve the stability of the relationship and get at the underlying risk factors, rather than separating the family and repeating a cycle of all of those unstable factors that do tend to be risks for criminal justice involvement. So I think it is we really have an opportunity to intervene, and so often we don't use it, and we just use this path of sending people to prison. We over-rely on it, and it just begets more problems for another generation.
That's another great point. Kelly, did you have a... All right, yeah.
I would like to add also, kind of in the same realm as like physically separating mother and child, a lot of places, or at least my institution, the visits that were permitted were non-contact. It was between like you see in like movies, like the phone and the glass window, and so mothers who were able to be visited by their children, like you couldn't, it's like young children, you couldn't like hug, you couldn't kiss and touch, and that puts like a huge strain on like the development of like the child and just that bond in general. And also, if like a woman is coming to like full term in her incarceration, she may leave, and I saw this happen in Barnstable, can leave to give birth, but after recuperating, she comes back to finish the sentence and like is separated from the newborn, and that's insanely detrimental to both the infant and the mother. Like they're immediately separated at birth for the remainder of the sentence or even longer, and like where is that child going to go?
That's another great point. And of course, common sense tells us that that's so detrimental to growth and development, and it's just insane to imagine that those policies are being implemented today. So I think that we're going to move along, and we're going to move on to our next question. So studies report that on just about every measure of drug use, women offenders in state prisons report about 40% usage. That's about 10% more than the average male state prison. So my question is, does this lead to different types of programming for women within the prison system, or different types of reentry options for these women? Or are they, again, as Georgia said, just kind of funneled into programs that were directed towards males?
I think Georgia's right on this one. So Georgia, take it away, because I do agree totally with you. This is directed and funneled strictly by men.
All
right. So Georgia, did you have anything to add?
Well, I think that the 40% number is an underreport of the number of people using, of the women using drugs and assault, and 30% would be an underreport of the men. And I mean, actually, I think a lot of prisons do have drug treatment programs, more than other kinds of therapeutic programs. And it's something that does tend to be available, but the programming that's for women is not different than the drug treatment programming that's available for men. But one upside is that generally men and women are not in the same facility, so they're not in co-ed drug treatment. So that's a plus. But it's, you know, it's drug addiction and substance use are very rarely the leading reasons that people commit crime. So dealing with the substance use is an important part of dealing with why people are locked up, but dealing with that alone is an incomplete response. And so there needs to be more than drug treatment, because we can get somebody sober, but then we need to deal with the other issues that are there, which will often include mental illness, often include, I mean, you've brought up employment, I think, and the fact that people hadn't worked, so there are many other issues that will have to be addressed. So it's a partial response, and it's not necessarily a bad response, but it's part of the puzzle.
In Barnstable, there was, for the men, I believe it was called a shock program. In the women's units, it was called RSAT, Residential Substance Abuse Treatment, and it was optional. You did not have to do it, but the incentive for many women to join it was the reward of potential good time, which is time taken off at the end of your sentence, so you can get out a little earlier. And so I agree that the main push was, as far as programming goes, was for substance abuse. Commitments from the outside would come into the prison, and you could go to pretty much nightly AA or NA meetings, which was great. But I think Georgia was the one that used this term, brought this up earlier. It was that, like, sometimes, I imagine the same for men, but for women in particular, you don't have to go. So I mean, the program might be offered and it might be beneficial, but you don't have to do it. And it's kind of individualistic, like how much you want to get out of it and what you want to put into it. And even so, if you do it, I agree with Georgia that, like, taking the substance away and, like, getting sober, getting clean is, like, a huge part of it, but that's just, like, a symptom of a bigger thing. It's like, why were you using? What was the abuse? What are the mental issues there? So it's really a whole new way to live, and all those other life skills are not
that's a great
adequately offered and taught.
I think it's hard to teach those things in a prison setting. It's hard for people to learn how to manage daily living in a setting where people don't have the responsibility or the freedom of our own daily activities. So I think it's a challenge.
It definitely is. Speaking of challenges for women, I think we're going to move along to our next question. And this is one of little discussed importance within the criminal justice system. And this deals with the female transgender community. So oftentimes an individual will be assigned to a prison based on biological sex as opposed to gender identity. And due to this policy, many transgender females in male prisons are reporting over 13 times more likelihood to be sexually assaulted while incarcerated, which is, of course, detrimental to effective rehabilitation. So my question to you is, what are some possible solutions to this violence? Georgia, did you want to go first?
I don't know if Christina was going to say something. No?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, no, go ahead, Georgia. I'll say something after.
I mean, I don't know if there's an easy answer. I think that the recommendation, I think that the national recommendation is that people be confined in facilities according to their identity, their gender identity. And I don't know who's doing a DNA test to figure out where people belong. And people often are in transition, so I think it's sort of, it's it's odd to me that people would necessarily be locked up according to biological sex. And, you know, I think it makes the most sense for people to be confined according to their gender identity. But I also think that there's, you know, the issues of safety and of, you know, there's the Prison Rape Elimination Act. There are issues of safety and violence in correctional facilities, and these are kind of larger issues that have a particular are of particular importance to people who become targeted. And I mean, I think that often people who are transgender end up getting arrested because of the kinds of work that they're forced into, and because they also get targeted by the police, so that there's some like larger societal issues that contribute to people getting arrested and getting locked up in the first place. And I think that at the front end, we could be doing a better job so that people aren't going into jail and prison in the first place for things that maybe they don't need to be confined. And I mean, I think you're probably getting this message from me loud and clear that jails and prisons really, I mean, I hear you talking about rehabilitation and the opportunity for rehabilitation in a prison, and I think that there are some prisons that really try to implement programs, but and that's wonderful, but for the most part, they're, especially with women, the kinds of risks and needs that women have that have contributed to their criminal behavior are things that can be very effectively dealt with in the community. Like, we're much better at dealing with mental illness, we're much better at dealing with prior trauma, we're better at dealing with parental stress, family dysfunction, educational needs, economic disadvantage. In community settings where people can acquire new skills, practice those skills in real settings, than sending someone to prison and trying to teach her how to be a better mother when her children are 300 miles away. So we could be so much smarter and save money and really help people connect more productively to their communities. So it's frustrating, right? Like, we want to do so much better, and we know enough to do better. So the best answer with people who are transgender is, like, stop sending so many people to prison for things that maybe they don't need to go to prison for in the first place.
Yeah, Georgia, I am so on you on this question. When this question comes up, I get very frustrated. And I think we have a small window of opportunity right now when we are actually, some of the them back to the jail system. Most of the people do not deserve to be in prison. And one of my pet peeves is even the women having served time on the prison nurseries. You know, if you're going to, one of the criteria is if you're going to go home with your baby within 12 to 18 months, you get on the nursery. Well, why the hell go ahead and send them there to begin with? There's other ways in the community you can serve out here. But I'm with you, Georgia. I think for my work with the fellows and at the Open Society Foundations and with the LGBTQ and with the sex offender stuff, it's ridiculous. Right. And we're criminalizing natural-born acts to a lot of people, identity issues, and they just want to warehouse them in prison. We really need to take this opportunity, be smart, and realize what we're really putting people in there for to begin with. And so this always irritates me when this question comes up, because I would say if I could count on my fingers, I could tell you how many women I wouldn't know what to do with, but the majority of them would serve better in different populations in our community and to get help and services. Absolutely.
And, you know, if our goal is to improve public safety and reduce the chance that someone will commit additional crime, then, I mean, I think you're right, we can do that so effectively in the community, and rarely is prison the answer. We don't usually need to confine people away from the community in order to reach that end. We aren't really, well, even punishment for people who want, I know that as a society we have this like need at some level to punish people. And when I think about the home-based alternative to incarceration program that we have no desire to punish people, but women who do this program definitely have to do some pretty hard work and face their internal demons and look at issues that are very difficult to look at, and sometimes say that going to jail is easier. So it's not easy to really get to the bottom of risk and issues for women to move forward, but it's work that at least, you know, we can see what the positive outcomes are, and we don't waste a lot of money and time and create more, you know, more problems and difficulty in a family and in a community. So yes, we could be.
And could I just?
But I'm sorry, you were trying to say something.
Could I just say one quick thing? I just wanted to say one quick thing. Georgia, you're absolutely right. And, you know, we're working with some fellows about community alternatives to incarceration, and a couple of our fellows are working with the community and don't dial 911 for everything. Let's see if the community can resolve these issues. I mean, even our own people in our devastated poor communities, we have to recondition them and reculture them that the best way is not 911 all the time. Sometimes there's resources in the community or need to build up community resources as moderators to moderate family situations, abuse situations, and so on and so forth. So some of our fellows right here are looking at other ways that the community can start being involved, whether you have money or you don't have money, and still protect safety. Incarceration does not equal safety, and we've got to get this out of people's minds. Locking someone up does not mean safety. It means that they're coming back to your community and harming you. They learn a lot of things in prison, and the failure, and then putting additional sanctions on them, they're just coming back. I mean, if you're taking away your housing, your food, and everything, what do you expect people to do? So at the same time, you know, there are inroads into this, and people are looking or trying to advocate for community responses to people like policing, incarceration, and we have to really educate our communities. Our communities, our poor communities, are basically colored and reconditioning them and reculturing them, pick up the phone so much.
We're both kind of passionate about this.
Yes, I guess we are.
All right, Kelly, did you have anything to add?
Nothing more to add. Just I agree completely with both. Said it better than I ever could have found the words for. So.
Same goes for me. It really is all about public health and safety, and as you guys have mentioned, there are so many more effective community avenues for that than simply incarceration. So I think we're going to move on to our next question. And this is one of the most difficult topics we're probably going to be talking about tonight, and that deals with prison suicide. So prison suicide is often the most such as these.
Hallie, you broke up a little bit there.
Okay. Would you like me to repeat the question?
Sure.
Please. All right. So my question was dealing with prison suicide, and just to reiterate, that's one of the most difficult topics I know we're going to be talking about this evening. So just to give you a little bit of background on prison suicide for our viewers, incarcerated females not only attempt suicide within the prison system 5 times more than women outside of prison, but also attempt suicide twice as often as males within the prison system. So my question again was just how can the institution better prepare itself to avoid future crises such as these?
Can I redirect the question back? I do have one more comment. We were talking about community alternatives to incarceration and like more. And I'm really sorry to divert back to this important topic as well. But I think it's an important topic to like bring up about the alternatives to prison, like because a lot of people, like there are like the intermediate sanctions, like what when you talk Georgia and Christina about community alternatives, what can you give specific examples of those?
Sure. I mean, the agency that I work for is part of a coalition of organizations in New York that have different alternative to incarceration programs. Some of them do defender-based advocacy and will try to get people sentenced to drug treatment and then other types of individualized treatment. So someone might need to go into like anger management, emotional like education, and might complete a GED and go into college, like depending on what someone's specific needs are. But the agency will work with that individual and report to the court regularly and really help track that case. And often these are people who have been arrested many times, who have a high risk of being rearrested, and we believe that people should really only be kept under supervision if they are at least medium or high risk to be locked up or to reoffend, because we shouldn't be keeping people in this net of supervision if they're not, at risk to be locked up. And if they weren't going to be incarcerated, we shouldn't be keeping them under supervision. So there are drug treatment, supervised work programs that really focus on building work skills and improving education, and then also really developing personal responsibility as there's some monitoring and supervision, but it's really moving towards people being more responsible for reporting for themselves, so that it's moving people away from this externalized locus of control where somebody else is always deciding what happens to you, and moving people towards taking more responsibility for reporting for themselves. My agency has a program that's just for women. It's called Justice Home. We started it almost 2 years ago, where we work with women to individually, we do a gender-specific risk and needs assessment that looks at, like if I got arrested, it would look at the specific reasons, what were my risk factors for committing crime. And even if I was selling drugs, it's quite unlikely that addiction would be the reason. Usually there's some of the issues we talked about before, prior trauma, mental illness, parental stress, things like that. So whatever my risk factors are would be the areas where I would need to have goals. And my case plan would actually have goals around reducing my risk in those areas. So basically we're trying to help women reduce the underlying, really get at the underlying reasons that they're driven to be involved in criminal behavior, in addition to working in other areas of their lives. And usually there are educational and economic issues that we're working on also. But the women stay in their own homes, and most of the time the women have children, and parental stress is an issue. So we're working with women on helping them better understand what's normal for children at different developmental stages. So we're supporting them in the parenting relationships. We're helping them get into decide what they want to be doing as an employment, helping them decide on an educational path, but doing it while they stay in their own home. I mean, the point is to use real life as the classroom and really to support people in learning and practicing and applying new skills in the everyday life in the community where they need to live long term. Because we found that even when we had a residential alternative to incarceration, there's this reentry period. And people, typically people will lose their housing. They'll be separated from family when they go into a residential treatment program of any kind. And so if, to the extent that we can keep people in the community, retain the housing that they already have, and keep them with their families and strengthen those relationships, we're really excited about being able to do that. And so far, women have been super successful, and hit some bumps and relapses along the way, which we expect. It's part of life, and so it's we can help women manage those issues and in the real course of their everyday lives. So that's our latest and greatest. I could go on all day about alternatives to incarceration and really alternative responses that I think would be more likely to reduce the. I mean, ideally, we would have people never even have to have a conviction attached, right? If we could defer prosecution, that would be ideal, because usually people take a plea to a lesser crime, and then when they complete the program successfully, the charges are dropped. But I mean, Christina brought up the issue of immigration. If someone has an immigration case, then the charges never go away, and it's also, people aren't always so religious about getting charges off of their records. So we're trying to move the line back even further so that convictions never attach. Christina, I'll let you say something.
Oh, Well, I probably would just have to brag on some of the fellows' work and encourage anybody to go on to the Open Society Fellows website, the Soros Justice Fellowship. But they've even stretched out between the great work, and I have been also the recipient of a lot of women's prisoners. Besides the service providers, all over the country, people are having innovative ideas. It's turning actually these old. We have a fellow who's an architect that's having architectural design of these closed prisons and having the architects come in and redesign the prison so it would be not cost effective of them reopening them. And different community service programs, whether it's a college. We also have another fellow in North Carolina that has decided, because sex offender registry is a death sentence for most children who get sex offenses for if you're 16 messing with your 14-year-old girlfriend. So that's a death sentence for a lot of these children, but diverting them into what is known as agriculture and entrepreneurship and having them live on what they call a rural farm community and learning, green agriculture and getting them to think entrepreneurial. So there's tons of work, believe it or not, that's going on, and really insightful work of what ways can we turn things around. Also, one of the most advanced work is really having the fellows think of sanctions. If we're going to close the prisons, what's the next sanction? And trying to cut that off at the head and say, we don't need any more incarceration. We don't need an alternative incarceration. So these are some of the community alternatives besides the basic service programs that people are really, really thinking forward and thinking of the future. And if they do close and the prisons, what's this going to look like? And we got to head that off before and get a hold on it before they do. So it's a lot of work is being done all over the country.
And all over the world. I mean, it was interesting. Last year, we had a fellow visit from Great Britain, from Wales, where they were considering, they don't have their own prison or jail for women in Wales. So if a woman is arrested and needs to be detained in Wales, she is sent to England to be held until she's tried. Right. And so they were going to build a prison in Wales. And I was working with a graduate student and professor from Wales who really were looking for some alternative solution. And so someone got a Churchill Fellowship to come to the United States last summer and look at different programs and approaches. And he actually presented to Parliament on using a justice home model and other things that he learned from visiting the States, where using a gender-specific assessment, we really could do something smarter so that there was no need to ship women several hours away, separate them from their families, when in the time that someone would be sent and detained, away from their family, away from their work, potentially lose their home, we could be doing something constructive. And of course, it comes back to this question, why are we responding to crime in the first place? And are we willing to acknowledge that in order to we have to be willing to allow people who have perpetrated crime to heal. Like, we have to be willing to accept the humanity of people who get arrested, and we have to want that. Like, we have to want people to continue to evolve and we have to be willing for every person in our community of humanity to be able to evolve and become a better version. Not just me and my best friend get to become the better version of themselves tomorrow, but we have to be accepting of that idea for everybody, whether it's somebody who's locked up right now or someone who might get arrested tomorrow or the people that we know and are very close to in our lives. But I mean, this is kind of the big issue, because we are so bent on punishing people, even though we know that it does not work. It does not reduce crime. It does not improve safety. And it actually contributes to a generation after generation of poverty and crime. So we're just being, foolish.
Georgia and Christina, do you guys think these community-based alternatives are effective for men as well, or are we thinking just specifically women offenders? Or does it not matter?
There are definitely programs that are effective for men. I think it's been a little easier to sell the idea of like our program where women are at home and they don't even leave their own homes. Sometimes it's easier to sell that because women are usually a lower risk to public safety. But, you know, if you do an individualized assessment of what the person's, you know, what the factors are that led a person to commit crime or to be involved in criminal behavior, you can always make a case if there is an intervention available. I mean, for us, the question becomes if this woman's risk factors are things that can best be addressed in a community setting. Like, where are the resources to deal with a woman's limited or her non-existent work history or her mental illness or her parental stress or family dysfunction, whatever the issues are, even her substance abuse. If the best resources are in the community, isn't that where we should be continuing to put resources and where we should be connecting her and having her use whatever skills she can acquire, rather than in a correctional facility where we're like retrofitting programs to try to help someone who happens to be there. So if it's, you know, the same is true for men, depending on the needs, then I think it also makes sense. You just only work with women.
That was a great point, especially dealing with how we can effectively rehabilitate and dissolve any public health or safety risk of these women before entering a state of incarceration. But something that I wanted to ask next, just as we close up this debate, deals with women who have already been incarcerated, who are still dealing today with the effects of incarceration, and also still the fact that they're being collaterally sanctioned for acts that they've since served their time for. So collateral sanctions often bar women from voting or receiving certain types of scholarships for higher education, receiving food stamps, as Georgia mentioned. It can often affect government housing status and much, much more. So I think that the last question tonight before we close out this panel is if you all wouldn't mind speaking a little more to this and providing some examples of how these continuous sanctions continue to pose challenges for reentry.
Well, I just wrote a paper in my criminal justice class about collateral sanctions, and just as Georgia and Christina got very passionate about discussing other issues, like that paper kind of got me going a little bit. I was specifically focusing on the collateral sanctions facing people in general, but with felony convictions related to drug charges. And it just gets me so frustrated because while the criminal justice system may not overtly set people up to fail, it makes it very, very hard to succeed. Like, for example, conditions of parole and probation are also like being employed, but that criminal record prevents you from getting many, many jobs. Your driver's license is taken away, so you can't get to the jobs. There's like fees and restitution you have to pay, but if you can't get the job, you can't pay that. And as far as women go, who are taking care of their families,
you have the book.
Yep.
Oh, I'll bring it to you.
But it's hard to come up with all the money to take care of their children as well as meet their legal obligations, and it keeps them stuck in this cycle. And a lot of probation, and I'm actually not sure if this is true for parole, but I think so. I think it's probation and parole. There are two kinds of violations. There's like a criminal violation, like committing a new offense, or technical violations by not paying a fee, missing an appointment, missing a drug test. And a lot of the violations of the terms of probation and parole are technical. It's not reoffending. It's just not being able to meet the terms that are imposed with probation or parole, which are often very hard conditions to meet. Like, I had to take, as part of my release, I would have to report for random drug testing. And my license was taken away. So if I didn't have people willing to drive me up there whenever it was happened to be my thing and I missed a call, like, I would have violated probation just because I wasn't allowed to get myself there. So it's a catch-22. It's a very like imposing system. So I went off in my paper about about all that.
But I mean, I think that's a pretty, actually a pretty succinct description of what I hear from a lot of the women who come to us, that there are so many ways that the systems, all of the systems that women will come into contact with and really need to rely on, particularly when women are first coming home. Like, very few of the women we see have a job with a living wage to come home to. So many women are relying on public assistance and on, like, they need housing, they'll have housing assistance, like a rent subsidy or something when they first come home. And in New York State, people are still eligible for that, even with a conviction. There are some barriers to going into public housing, but people can still be eligible for a lot of public assistance. But it's not enough to pay for the Metro card that someone would need to get to all of the appointments that they need to go to. We met with someone today who was a client with our agency for quite a while. She's done very well. She hasn't used in years and years. She hasn't had criminal justice involvement in at least 5 years. She's in school. She's doing everything right. And she couldn't get to her appointment to us on time today because she had to wait until somebody could swipe her into the subway because she couldn't afford to buy a Metro card. So, I mean, and she didn't want to jump the turnstile because that would have been against the law. So there are all these, and it is very hard to get a job because there's so much competition for jobs for people who don't. I mean, this woman hasn't completed a college degree yet. So, I mean, there are a lot of ways that when you think about so many women going into prison who, what'd you say, I think 40% of the women had a legal job when they entered prison. So there aren't usually great job training programs for women in prison. More of the job training programs are in men's prisons because there are more men in prison. So that's where more of the job training programs are. So women are unlikely to come out with new job skills. And so it's likely that they will need to build on their employability when they come out before they're going to get a great job with a living wage. And so it takes some time, and it can be very frustrating. And it gets exhausting asking people to help all the time. And it's very appealing to go back to the people who could help you out, who are often the antisocial associates who were involved in illegal activity. So it is, we say that people pay their debt by doing their time, but we just pile it on afterward. And the kinds of fees that people are expected to pay, I know someone who has a restitution bill that I think is $30 million. It is inconceivable that this bill will ever be paid, but it is. I mean, every time someone gets a job, they know that their check will be garnished to help pay back restitution. And so it's just, we do make it so difficult for people unless you have a great attorney who's in there advocating for you while you're locked up. And if everyone had that, then they wouldn't be locked up. So there are so many little ways that don't get people's attention because they seem like they're minor, but they sure do add up and make it difficult to get to the appointments that people need to get to and to comply with all of the conditions that get piled on. So, and that's not even including the fact that you can never work in a financial institution if you have a felony, and you can't live in certain kinds of federally funded housing. And there's some of these collateral consequences don't even make sense. But the people who committed the really big crimes, the billion-dollar crimes at the banks, they're doing okay after prison.
All right. And Christina, did you want a chance to close out our panel tonight? Did you have a comment?
I think they've done it.
All right. Well, I guess that concludes our panel tonight. I just want to thank you all again so much for all of your thoughtful feedback. And I realize that there is definitely so much more to discuss on all of these important topics. I realize that we have only scraped this very, very surface of all of these discussions. But our time here on this webinar is nearing the end. So if anyone has any closing remarks, of course, you're welcome to state them at this time. Otherwise, I would just like to thank you all again for all of your time, and for our incredible panelists for sharing their knowledge with us, as well as the Student Alliance for Prison Reform. for sponsoring our event. So thank you all, and have a good night. If anyone wants any more information on any of the topics discussed, of course, feel free to seek out the Student Alliance for Prison Reform on our Facebook page or on our Twitter, and that's @Prison Alliance, or through our website. So thank you all so much again, and have a great night.